Okay, I thought I'd try a little experiment here. I have a thrice weekly little bit of a commute to my teaching job, which is now back on campus. So I thought I would do a video en route since I have some talking time. I know it's a weird angle. I'm not sure how the camera mic is doing, but check it out, see how it works. One thing I wanted to talk about, which I find fascinating, was actually prompted by my weekly views of Ted Woodford's videos on his Luthier channel. I watch his videos because I think it's the best Luthier channel I've found on YouTube for high-end professional repair work. I've done a video on him before and mentioned that it's not just the standard of his work and his methods, but also his research that he does on each of his subjects being the instruments on his bench. You get a back history. He does his research and puts time and thought into it at a level that I don't find with a lot of repair channels. But one question he gets a lot, and I've had it a few times, and I'm thinking to address it, are people that ask you, how do you learn to do guitar repair? How does one become a luthier? Is it something that I can do? I have a passion for guitars. You know, I'd like to work for myself and work on my passion all day. And his response is usually quite scathing, sarcastic even. And I understand the nature of it, having worked now with instruments in various capacities for quite a while. And I would say a few things about that. First of all, if you want to get into guitar repair, restoration and heavy-end or high-end stuff, it's probably better that you go to one of the programs for that kind of work and get a proper education. Now, there's a number of ways of doing this. You can go to a program like Red Wing, where they have both a violin and a guitar side. And you can learn traditional lutherie. It's expensive. It will require you to invest in a bunch of tools, but you're going to need them anyway. And you learn from seasoned professionals from the ground up. There are other programs. I think there's one in Chicago. And you can also maybe get an apprenticeship with a shop, repair shop, perhaps. It's probably getting harder and harder. Some are paid, some are not. But it's possible that you might get someone to take you on. I would say that if you were interested in full restoration and repair at a professional level, it's probably a good idea to have some rudimentary woodworking skills. The shop I used to work at, which was an old shop started in the 50s that specialized in double basses and the rest of the violin family, a well-established shop, and was the birthplace of a lot of top luthiers, well-known luthiers in the business. Rather than find people passionate about instruments or even musicians, what they did is find skilled cabinet makers, people with good rudimentary woodworking skills and practices, because they found it easier to convert a decent woodworker with good habits and a rudimentary understanding of the way wood works and some carpentry background. They found it easier to convert those people into good repairmen than your average guitar player. And that's no knock on musicians, it's just that the woodworking aspects of the trade are probably more important than the ability to actually play the instrument. Of course, if you can play the instrument, it gives you some insights into tonal properties and the way an instrument works, but it's not 100% necessary. I've met a lot of top luthiers who are either not musicians at all, or they are very beginner-like musicians on the instruments that they work on. I found it far less often that you come across a really good musician that happens to be also a great luthier. So I would say that if you have some woodworking background, it's going to give you a jump into any kind of lutherie training, because those are the principles that you're going to apply to working on instruments, particularly if you have a good background of working with hand tools. Because a lot of the stuff you do when you're doing restoration is minuscule whittling. The whittling process is most of what you do. So if you've had some experience with gouges, chisels, it's going to put you in better stead for working on musical instruments, particularly of the stringed instrument variety. Now, it may be that you don't want to work on full restoration, you just want to do setups. Now that's quite different. That's more of a guitar tech kind of background, and there's some argument, I've done a video on it before, of what constitutes a luthier. In my mind, a luthier is somebody who either builds instruments or does high-end restoration of vintage instruments, which almost needs the same skill set. So that's what a luthier is to me. If you just want to learn how to do setups and maybe work in a guitar shop doing standard setups, that's slightly different. I don't feel, although it would be helpful if you have some woodworking background, I think you can learn how to do a standard guitar setup or stringed instrument setup without necessarily having a whole lot of woodworking experience, which was my case. When I started working at this shop many years ago, my first job with musical instruments, I actually was brought in to run the front end of the shop, and it was my curiosity that took me back in the shop to learn whatever I could from the luthiers that were working there at the time I was there, which was quite a few really high skilled and very different luthiers. So I basically went into it without having any real experience with woodshop or working with the kind of tools that you need for instrument repair. If I had some cabinet making background, I think that I would be probably, I would have found it an easier transition. But you know, you're kind of learning from scratch if you're going into it without any woodworking background. But learning how to do setups is slightly different. I would say that if you are naturally a patient person and that you have no problem doing minuscule work that takes hours, and you don't get frustrated and tend to throw things, you probably have the right mentality for working on instruments. It is very finicky work. You're working in small increments. Sometimes you're moving parts literally fractions of millimeters to get your setup right. It also requires a dogged, and I mean dogged, obsessive penchant for measuring and having correct measurements. So if you're somebody who likes to eyeball things and sort of sidestep the whole measure twice, 3 times kind of ethos, then you're probably going to find it more difficult to work on instruments. It requires an incredible amount of patience, and a lot of times you're working through attrition to figure out what's wrong with an instrument, why an instrument is not performing adequately, and it's literally some minuscule measurement somewhere in the body of the instrument that's throwing it all off. So it takes a lot of patience. So I think, and I've seen some bad luthiers in my time, they tend to be short-tempered, impatient types. It doesn't make for a good mix with this kind of work. But if you are incredibly patient, long-suffering, you know, you don't get frustrated easily, you're fairly calm demeanor, and you can work with small, finicky things. You know, like you're good at crocheting, or you know, things that require a lot of patience and skill, then you can transfer that same mindset to working on instruments. If your interest in working on instruments is purely from a player's perspective, you might also find it a little bit difficult. Unless you just want to learn for setting up your own guitars, then it's perfect. But if you're setting up guitars for other people or for general sale, you've got to sometimes work against your own preferences, your own inclinations. For instance, you know, you might be setting up a guitar for a country player or a heavy flat picker, and they need a completely different setup than, say, you would on that guitar for your style of playing. So you've got to be malleable, you've got to be open-minded, but also you've got to have principles and be firm when the occasion requires for it. For instance, some players might insist on some shortcut that would damage the guitar, and then you have to be the one person in the room that's willing to say, look, I wouldn't advise that. You're going to have bigger problems down the road if you don't do this the right way. So you need to have a special blend of open-mindedness, but also a firm belief in basic principles that need to be followed, or at least advised. Sometimes you can't get musicians to take your advice. I've been in that position before as well. But you got to lay the law down, and sometimes you know, you're working long hours. You're working. You miscalculate a job, and it takes you a lot longer than you thought it would. And even top luthiers do this. They bill for, or they put an estimate out for 3 hours work, and it ends up taking 6. And sometimes you have to eat some repair time. Some of your time. So all those things you got to be prepared for, you know, in doing this kind of work. It sounds really, and this is something Ted often says, it sounds like a glamorous job to be a luthier, or you know, an instrument repair person or a setup person. A lot of it isn't glamorous. For instance, if you're working on violins, most of the work you're going to be doing is very repetitive. 9 out of 10 of the instruments that come into your shop, you're just going to be doing basic setup for people that have no clue how to set up their own instrument. You're going to be cutting an awful lot of bridges for violins, which is a very, very difficult thing to do, and takes a long time, requires a lot of patience, and is very repetitive work. Same with guitar work. You're going to be doing a lot of basic setup. You're going to be doing a lot of action adjustments, lowering or raising or cutting new saddles, making new nuts, regrooving new nuts, doing spot fret work, lowering high frets, beveling fret ends. It's not as glamorous as you think it's going to be. I'd say 1 in every 15, 20 jobs might be interesting and unique, or at least the guitar you're working on might be interesting and unique. But you're going to be working on a lot of mundane types of setups on very normative guitars that you see every day. And it's exasperating too. You're going to come across guitars that won't adjust, or are difficult to adjust, or it takes you forever to find out what that incremental problem is. Even top luthiers spend an hour chasing down some mysterious buzz, trying to figure out what's producing it, where it's coming from, and how to eliminate it. So, you know, you shouldn't go into it with any sort of delusions at all. A lot of the work you're going to be doing is repetitive, non-glamorous, irksome, taxing. A lot of times people expect you to be done with something a lot quicker than you're able to get to it. Good repair people get backed up with work too. It's very common for them to have 10, 20 guitars sitting in line waiting for repair, and then you get some guy that comes in that expects you to do his guitar right away and has a fit when you tell him it's going to be a week. So you have to sort of also be your own marketer. You also have to be able to set your own pricing and be willing to be wrong. And you also have to deal with some difficult customers and deal with lots of what feels like unnecessary correspondence, repetitive correspondence. This is something that Ted complains about as well. I almost have a separate email account just for dealing with people with instruments, and I spend, you know, sometimes an hour or more a day just doing repetitive replies to, is this instrument still available? What's the nut width? What's the scale length? Can you measure the button bouts? What strings do you have on it? In a rating of 1 out of 10, how would you rate the neck? How does it sound? What kind of pickups are in it? Is it all solid when you've advertised it as only solid top and they're getting it for $120? That kind of stuff is endless. You have to have patience in that regard as well. You have to be able to answer those kinds of questions and not lose patience with people. So it is only for certain people. I don't think it's for everyone. And you may say, well, that's not unlike the job I have now. I have to deal with people that requires a lot of patience. And that's true. There are a lot of things in life that take this kind of skill and patience level. I'm not saying that, you know, instrument work is 100% unique. I mean, if you're a plumber or doing any sort of crafted manual labor, of course, you know, you have to hone a certain temperament and skill set that enables you to do good work to attract more work. So it's not something that's alien, but people sometimes go into it without fully knowing exactly what's required. And that sort of brings up my last point. Like everything else in society, the business is saturated. So if you go into instrument repair, or, you know, you're just advertising in your neighborhood guitar setups, you have competition right away. You have a number of shops that are offering the same thing and warrantying their work. So you're going to find more people are more trusting of going to a shop where the work is warranted rather than some guy who lives down the street who's doing it for extra cash. So you've got to be immediately willing to enter into competition with people around you that are doing the same thing, doing it better, doing it longer, having more experience than you have. And you've also got to be in competition with yourself, because you've got to improve, otherwise you're not going to last. Your first few setups are going to be poor, substandard. It's probably a better idea if you buy a couple of really cheap, crappy guitars off eBay or something to sort of practice on and learn on before you take on somebody else's guitar. Because I guarantee you that, you know, when you just start out and you're feeling confident enough to take on, you know, public work, somebody else's setup or repair, Somebody's going to walk through your door with a 1970s Martin and say, hey, can you set this up? And you're going to see it needs a neck reset, and that's going to be beyond your capability, and you're going to have to ship that off to someone else, or you're going to be stupid enough to try to do the work and ruin their guitar, because that's one of the most difficult repair jobs in all of restoration lutherie. So you kind of got to know your stuff and have to have a certain level of skill before you can take on public repair work or setup work. Otherwise you're going to run into trouble. However, if you're just doing it for yourself, either for guitars that you're keeping or possibly thinking of reselling, that's probably a good way to start, actually, and gain confidence and skill and some experience before you start taking on general repair work. Maybe just set up a few guitars, either for yourself, friends, or just guitars maybe that you'll resell, and see how you do, see what people think of your setups and what you need to improve, and then you have a chance of lasting at the business. So I just thought I would put this out there, because I often get asked, how do you get into it? I really love guitars. I'd like to quit my job and just work on guitars all day, and I just want there to be a sense of realism, and people understanding exactly what it entails before you make such a leap. Don't quit your day job, all right? Do it as an extra job for a while until you build up a skill, a reputation even, and perhaps a market. Don't just launch into it and strap yourself economically. Maybe do it on the side as a second job for a while and see how it goes. Maybe map out 6 months, a year, and see how it goes. And be willing to fail a few times and lose a few guitars along the way, because you will make some bad decisions, some irreversible decisions. So that's why I advocate maybe buying a couple of $50 junkers off of eBay to do those first few jobs, so that if you wreck them, you're not out $300-400 or of your money or somebody else's money. So that's my take on that question. If you're really set on doing it, you can do it. Maybe starting out as a setup person and then moving into more complicated repair. If you want to go into full professional restoration, there are programs, there are schools. I think there's a 1-year program, a 6-month program, reputable luthier schools around the country. It's expensive, but I think that it'll give you the right rudimentary background to go into this kind of work, and maybe set yourself up as an apprentice at a shop for a while as well. It may be low pay, but you'll get some experience under your belt, and you'll develop a reputation. So those are my thoughts about becoming a guitar tech setup person or a full-blown luthier. Hope it's helpful. See you, folks.